Hello, and welcome back to the last episode of this season of the Publisher Podcast from Media Voices. I'm Esther Thorpe, and we're finishing this season with a panel from last year's Publisher Summit, all about strategies for converting newsletter readers into paying subscribers. Now, it's a good time to mention that early bird bookings for this year's Publisher Summit are now open. We'll be holding the summit on July the 8th at a really cool venue near Paddington in London, with a single main stage focused on direct-to-audience product strategies. But if you're specifically interested in newsletters or podcasts, we're still shaping the agenda so that you can sit on a relevant main stage session and then step out for dedicated workshops, so there'll always be something valuable to get involved with. The summit's going to take place before the Publisher Podcast and Newsletter Awards in the evening, both of which are now open for entries. More details about tickets, entering the awards and more at voices.media/events. So back to this week's episode. This panel featured Henry Seltzer, Director of Newsletter Operations at Bloomberg, Joshi Herrmann, founder at Mill Media, and Rosie Percy, Newsletter Strategy Director at Hearst UK, moderated by Chris Sutcliffe. The panel explored tips and tools used to convert free newsletter subscribers to a paying product, from testing and optimization to campaigns and messaging. Here's Chris kicking the panel off.
So unconverted readers then are a untapped opportunity. They are, a limitless source of potential. They're incredibly frustrating because they will not click to pay, which is very annoying. So in this, we're going to talk about how you actually go about converting people, making them aware of their own willingness to pay for quality products, the language you use, when you start breaking down and begging for this kind of stuff. So to begin, Joshi, I wondered, Mill is very much at the forefront of local news and getting people to pay for that. I just wondered what you have found historically has been a really good way to convince people to get them over the line and to get them to support you.
Yeah, it's sort of a fundamental question, isn't it? I think we have found that trying to set up the relationship you have with your readers as less of a transactional relationship in which they're buying content, like buying a certain bit of premium content, and more like a relationship where they feel like they are part of something that they want to be part of. They have a connection to the media company, they have a connection to the brand, and by having a connection that makes their life better in some way. That is a more durable way of getting them to pay. So we've had times where we've had stories, individual stories that have been really successful, and we've had lots of people join after that moment. But you lose some of the people who you get on a big story, but you tend not to lose so many people who come in because they really like your overall brand, they like the overall proposition. In our case, because we're local, I think there's a desire on a lot of people's part to feel connected to the places that they live. And I think if our brands allow people to feel connected to the places that they live and to feel part of a media company that they believe in, I think that's been an important thing for us.
That's fascinating. I wondered then, how does that work then with Hearst UK? So obviously, Joshi there was talking about making people feel like they have that relationship. How does that work for you guys then when it comes to conversion?
I think Hearst is really different in the fact that you're looking at more local news and building those relationships. And I think that connection to what's local. But obviously with Hearst, we're quite a different beast, really. None of our content is paywalled, and the revenue that we are making from content is mostly in paid memberships and events. So why go back to the beginning, really, to make sure that the product we're delivering in newsletters is the best product it can be before I then look at commercializing it? So Hearst migrated to a new platform at the beginning of last year. We use Seltzer at the moment, and that was a huge part for us to then really refine the product we were offering. So we had custom templates per brand. We didn't have that before. We could really deep dive into analytics. Where are people clicking? Where are people engaging and not? Segment audience users to make sure we're not just spamming users who are disengaging. We can target users who are starting to drop off. So just really honing that initial experience before we then push them down the line to like a lower funnel, bigger investment and bigger commitment, which is purchasing a membership. Now that we've got that process that I think is pretty refined, and we're performing at a level that is above industry standard in quite a few ways, which we're really proud of curating for our readers, is now that we can look at how do we then make them pay for the services that we are commercializing. So for example, we knew that Prima readers, the content that's most popular for them from newsletter was puzzles. And so we put just puzzles behind a paywall with one free to play that we can say you can play this freely per day, but when that's run out, what do? I pay for New York Times above Wordle for a reason, and so do they. So it's identifying what content the readers are loving, still giving them a little something, but re-upgrading that. We did the same with Good Housekeeping. We had Goodreads, which is more like a book club program, and now we have in-person book club moments if you're a member. So it's showing that content and what you get available. So with Good Housekeeping, for example, we can, or any brand where we've got a membership platform at the moment, we can identify in our platform a user based on their membership status. So whether you're active or not and what level of membership you are. So if you're a trial, if you're a committed member, we can then show dynamic content based on your membership status. So if you're a non-paying member, we can say you can play 10 puzzles a day if you're a member. But if we're then showing that person who is a member saying, don't forget to play your 10 a day. So it's reminding the people of the services that they have available if they are paying. And then it's showing people sort of, here's what you could have had with content that we know they've had a previous affinity with, and then moving them up the line to then pay for more of it.
That's fascinating. We'll definitely touch on more of that in a second. Henry, I wondered, to what extent is what they're saying, resonating with you, and how, particularly with what Joshi said about not wanting to feel transactional, to what extent can Bloomberg do that?
Well, I would say that it's a bit of both. We are seeing a lot of success with our personality-driven newsletters. So Matt Levine, John Authors, Joe Weisenthal, Tracy Alloway, Ashley Carmen, we're bringing people into the door, or people who are following those writers, who are dedicated to seeing value there. As part of this, we've put half of our newsletter portfolio behind the paywall in the last few months. So we have over 70 newsletters, and more than half are behind the paywall. So we did a pretty aggressive messaging campaign around that. And we see newsletters as value add to the value of the subscription itself. So they're getting all of the Bloomberg.com subscription and content plus subscriber-only newsletters. We're seeing a distinction between a broad newsletters that have a broader base. The free newsletters are broader base, broader appeal, and then the subscriber newsletters are analysis, in-depth reporting, original insights that you're not going to get if you're not a subscriber.
I wonder then, could you maybe take us through how you actually went about that aggressive messaging? How was that sort of got across the value that people were going to get from their newsletters? How did you get that across in that messaging?
Well, a lot of the lists we migrated from free to paid. So we were doing messaging within the newsletters, at the top of the newsletters, targeting different subsets of the newsletter readers, plus on-site messaging, plus marketing emails, and plus additional marketing emails that contained messaging from the authors and the editor-in-chief.
How about you mentioned the kind of very personality-led newsletter there as being important. For Hearst, how does that work out as well? Do people have that direct relationship with a newsletter writer in the same way, or is it more of a sort of relationship with a brand that gets them to convert?
I think it's more brand, but as you mentioned, with the connection with personality-led newsletters, we have started to lead into that more, building newsletters with a smaller but highly engaged user base, where, again, we're not charging for them, but we believe at the moment it could be an entryway into a paid newsletter. So Esquire launched About Time, which is a watch-focused newsletter, which is, I think, the second most content vertical across Esquire, and has a smaller than the general newsletter audience, but really, really hyper-engaged. Also, even though it has a smaller audience, we've been able to sell advertising tendencies in it with watch brands. And because people, they'll read a 3,000-word newsletter on watches. We had a 6,000-word newsletter on watches before. But because those people on those lists are so engaged with that subject, we're able to then build based on that niche subject and the person writing it. Same with Red, launched Love Red at summer last year. And the way that's been styled is it's a VIP newsletter containing everything we normally keep for ourselves. And it's, again, very personality-led, because we know that already, although it's a connection with the brand, it is the editors that make that brand. And it's that access that you wouldn't get elsewhere in the free-to-read content or newsletter. So while we build up these newsletters at the moment are smaller audiences, still free to sign up, we have the extra added incentive of, if you sign up to these newsletters, you get access to content or events that you wouldn't get elsewhere. So with Love Red, we're hosting a series of style and supper clubs where we'll partner with a brand and food provider, and we'll say go to Rixo and you'll get food there, you'll meet the Red editors, you'll style an outfit together. You can only get those tickets first access via Love Red. So then we're building up the incentive there to these smaller newsletters with the mind of, once we started building that, we can then follow a similar path and then convert them into a paid newsletter when they know the value it's adding.
So it's really about communicating that value proposition, as and when. Yeah. And actually leads neatly onto this next question. Joshi, I wondered, often when we talk about conversion, we're talking about it as an ongoing process. We're talking about it as a constantly on piece of messaging that says, look, you will get this if you, sign up, or you will be supporting our mission as well. But to what extent can you do almost ad hoc conversion attempts? Is it better to be always on, or is it sometimes better to kind of take a step back and say, we have been bombarding potentially, it's now time to go, actually, we'll communicate this again when we have something else to share?
I think it's both. So there are people who, when they come across one of our brands, we have local newsletters in 6 cities now. When someone comes across it, they like it, they join the free list, and within a week or two, they join the paid list, because that's what they feel a particular connection to the brand, or they really like what we're doing. And then I think there are a lot of other people who need like a kind of specific reason to join something. It's sort of like that theory about riots. Like, there are some people who will join if there are like 2 people rioting, but there are some people who will only join if there are like, 1,000 or whatever. Some people will only join a paid subscription if there feels like there's a sort of like overwhelming persuasive reason to do so. And so we find that, for example, after we've done a big story about something, if we write a newsletter from that reporter explaining how they did the story, the work that went into it, the legal checks that had to go into it, the whole rigmarole of investigative journalism, that there are certain people who will sign up at that moment, but who wouldn't have signed up when the story was published. There are also, I think, people who are, more price sensitive. So when you do a discount, they'll come in, but they won't come in otherwise. So you try and capture those people at particular moments. So I think it's kind of like always on, but recognizing that different segments of people are motivated by different things. And we try to kind of think, what are the key moments to speak to readers about a particular topic? So I guess we're probably more at the ad hoc end of the spectrum.
Oh, makes sense. I like that riot-based theory of conversion.
Yeah.
If you could just pass the mic back down to Henry, then I wondered, how do you go about deciding when is the right time to make a conversion approach to people? Obviously, you have vast email lists. Is it sort of a very blanket thing, or can you be incredibly granular about realizing when people are likely to convert, their propensity to pay?
Yeah, we've been very careful about timing the migration so that we're over communicating what's happening, and people who are in the door already have a sense of the value of the newsletter and what they would miss out on. And then we continue to message after a newsletter is behind the paywall, your access has expired. We've experimented with giving people the top of the newsletter, which is what we've experimented with doing with Mark Gurman's Power On newsletter, since that's a large list. His newsletter is about Apple and consumer tech. Again, a lot of our newsletters have dedicated following, so it's really just about respecting the relationships that have already been built. And then I also wanted to add on what you said about watches, because we have a watch club newsletter as well, and we have a watch newsletter and a spirits newsletter, and those are examples, as you said, of these niche audiences, and we're seeing value in a smaller engaged lists of paying users as opposed to large lists. We're really seeing the engagement go up on the smaller subs only newsletters.
Nice. I know that Condé is also doing a watch newsletter, so my takeaway is get into watch newsletters at this point. Rosie, then how about yourself? When you're making an approach, is it important to realize how long people have been part of the wider ecosystem before you do attempt to convert, or can it be almost as soon as they have signed up?
It's timed in a way where the same message goes out to the same people at the same time. But the way that we are sending to our audience is mindful of how engaged or disengaged they are. So we know that someone's been signed up since X days, but if they signed up over X days ago and haven't engaged in X days since, that's then when we'll start a life cycle of, do you want to hear from us anymore? Are you breaking up with us? And that's when we keep people engaged and make sure that spamming people who aren't reading our emails anyway, and that we're reaching the most engaged readers. My rule of thumb, that is totally anecdotal, is that I don't like to have same creative or messaging running for more than 3 weeks at a time in a weekly newsletter cycle, because I know if I've seen something 3 times, I haven't clicked it, I ain't clicking it.
A lot of nodding going on.
So the way that we are making it work is just seeing are things performing well. If we need to tweak a little bit for general performance, if we've got something new to add, we'll do that too. So it depends on the type of conversion we're trying to make. So if it's to a paid membership, it will be kind of weekly, but the content of it will change. So we'll have under Prima, we'll have new member content published each week. It'll be a craft plan and an event, and we'll change that weekly in the free newsletter with different messaging. This week you can join Sarah Davies while she does this thing, and you can get this crochet pattern. And it's just depending on the content we've got available, but it is a kind of constant, something to be constantly mindful of the content we have versus the action we want people to take, because it is an investment to part with that for a membership.
Yeah, of course. I wonder then if we go down the line, is there anything that you felt, Joshi, has outperformed or underperformed in terms of what you thought would deliver conversions? Was there anything that you thought would absolutely smash it and that underperformed, or vice versa?
Well, I think that there is a very big variation we find in the moments that people will convert to paying and when they won't. And because our journalism is very varied, so I think if we were running like a watch newsletter, we'd be giving a fairly consistent stream of content about that topic. But because we're covering local news, there'll be like times where we've done a few big stories that people have really appreciated, and we will find that our membership messaging at that time will perform not just like a 2 or 3 times, but like 10 times better than a time where maybe we've done some slightly quiet stories. Maybe we haven't captured the reader's imagination, and then we do a membership appeal and it doesn't work so well there. So we're very tied to the sort of quality of what we've put out, which at times can maybe be a little bit nerve-wracking. You're very on your wits, you know.
Yeah.
But it does mean that you get really big growth moments at particular times when your journalists have done well. And because we have 6 different cities, it now kind of balances itself out, you know. So a city can have a quiet month and the other ones are cross-subsidizing it by beating their targets or whatever. So that's what I find. I can't remember anything that, like, any specific messaging that really underperformed, but I've definitely noticed that the ones that do well tend to be the ones where there's a kind of a bit of an emotional value to the appeal, as well as a kind of intellectual appeal or a rational appeal. I think there's, like, particularly with local news, but I think this definitely goes for some of the New York Times marketing and some of the Economist marketing. If you can get people to feel something in the way you're marketing your subscriptions, that's quite powerful compared to just making an argument for, like, you know, what you're going to get. There is a lot of feeling out there of people wanting to feel part of things, as I said earlier, and I think quite emotional language around being part of stuff can be quite successful. So
you will die unless you read this newsletter. All right, fantastic. Rosie, I was talking to a local publisher in the States, and they got a celebrity endorsement, and they thought that would be really, really good for their newsletter, and ended up underperforming. So was there anything that you thought was going to be a dead cert that ended up not being, you know, one of the, you know, a huge driver?
I think we've had a few that maybe we would have expected to do a little stronger. So sometimes with, like, Good Housekeeping's book club, we'll have, like, tickets will sell out 1 month and then the next month it won't. It depends how much that title in the book club is resonating. And then it also depends on the cover stars that you have as well, which is obviously not newsletter dependent. So we had last month, I'm sure many people here would have seen, Men's Health, we had Ben Shepherd, and that went everywhere. And then we had Davina McCall on Women's Health same month, Damp Squib, which was wild because we worked really closely with Davina on that. And it was because while we're also getting these stars who, you know, Ben Shepherd, incredibly ripped at 50 years old, people like that story, but also that was, you could get his workout plan if you upgrade to a membership, and that did incredibly well. So I think we had 3 times the amount of clicks on the link to upgrade to buy the plan or buy the membership to get access to the plan than we did on any other lead story in newsletter that week, that month. And I think it is just totally dependent on the content that you have available and how you market it as well. But sometimes it's so unpredictable, like you think something's going to smash and it just...
Yeah, it doesn't work out.
That's showbiz, baby.
So, Henry, we've had sort of driven by the news cycle, you know, driven by cover stars as well. I wondered, to what extent do you feel like Bloomberg is known for kind of very, very high value information. It's known for consistency as well in what it delivers. To what extent do you feel like that is vital in actually getting people to convert? When they consume a newsletter, they go, I'm still going to be getting the same high quality stuff in the newsletter as I would elsewhere with Bloomberg.
Yeah, so as far as messaging goes, the message from the editor-in-chief overperformed as opposed to more generic, you should follow this limited time offer, but we're appealing to different audiences here. Also, riding the news wave of the last few weeks of market instability and volatility has resulted in tremendous newsletter subscriptions as well as .com subscriptions. And then one other note is that we experimented with a skinny newsletter bundle of putting 5 tech newsletters behind the paywall, as well as providing those skinny bundle subscribers with access to the articles linked within the newsletters. And it wasn't as successful as we expected.
Did you just pull that out of the air? That's unbelievable. Oh, for the audio listeners, yeah, he just grabbed a fly out of the air. It was incredible.
Yeah, so I think people are increasingly used to paying for content in the marketplace. And we've, for the last few years, been adding additional value to the .com subscription, not just with newsletters, but with games and live blogs and live Q&As and the ability to interact with our writers and reporters more. And I think as we're entering this new environment where SEO is crashing and AI is coming for us, the more we can get readers to be involved and engaged on an ongoing basis, the more sustainable the whole model is.
I'm really glad you brought up the bundle there, because that we need to talk about that. We need to talk about the extent to which an individual newsletter on its own can convert. So I wondered, if we stick with you, Henry, and then we work our way back down, to what extent do you feel audiences' propensity to pay, as Esther teed up in the very end of the last session, has progressed to the point where an individual newsletter, as long as it's priced correct, can be a product that people are willing to convert for in their own right? Or should it be as part of that kind of the wider subscription package?
For us, it's just not something that we're in the market of doing. We experimented with this smaller bundle that had 5 tech newsletters behind the paywall so that we could try entering a non-core Bloomberg market. I think the better value and the better success has been with the full subscription. And there's probably more ways of doing more things to deliver to the full core audience. But really, it comes down to, as ever, just delivering the right message, the right content to the right audience at the right time. And I think sometimes we can overlook the simplicity of it. We can get distracted looking at numbers and analytics when the people will pay for good content and people want to read good content. And I do think it comes back to respecting the readers, because I can be on calls about what we should be doing as opposed to considering it from a reader perspective, where as a reader, you can tell when care has gone into a newsletter or other content packaging, and you do feel that level of the value of curation, the value of editing, and all the pieces that go along with it.
Rosie, not necessarily just for Hearst UK, but what do you feel like the rise of the individual-led newsletter, on platforms like Substack, has done to people's willingness to pay for kind of an individual newsletter in and of itself?
I think it's really opened people up to it when they're thinking of where they're going to invest their money, and you see that level of exclusivity, content you can't get elsewhere, and access you can't get elsewhere. I think opens people's eyes to what's available to them. And I do think the rise of Substack and creators on Substack have done wonders in terms of opening people up to that. Like I know you mentioned earlier, there are some, Netflix and Spotify, etc., that will always pay for. So you'd want to pay for a newsletter as well. I do think that personality and a really strong exclusive content is going to be really, really important in doing that. I know that although we don't have paid newsletter models right now, it will be something that maybe at one point we will face, and we'll have to work out how that works too. How do we make sure that the content people are getting is content that they can't get elsewhere? And I think that's what we're doing with these smaller, hyper-engaged audiences at the moment, to make sure that we're lining up something that you genuinely can't get elsewhere and is really worth parting with your money with for.
That's really interesting as well. We just, this morning we heard from Andrew Palmer, from The Economist, and he does, the kind of the very financial-led newsletter. He also does now the Bartleby column, which is a newsletter as well, which contains exclusives, but it's much more personality-driven. It's not that kind of hard and fast analysis. It's almost what's bugging him today. So to what extent do you feel like that kind of personality, exclusive content can help with that conversion process?
I think so. And this might sound a bit cheesy, but I do think that being in someone's email inbox is a privilege. And I think that should be something that should be really respected, especially when we're looking at, especially in recent years, a lot more publishers are leaning more into newsletters as an owned and operated platform that is less impacted by the whims of tech billionaires. So I think it's just remembering that and being on such a personal platform and mirroring that in the content that you're delivering, I think is really important. And I know if I want to open an email from someone in my inbox, I want it to read like it's a letter from someone that I know, and I don't want it to just be a list of links to a site with nothing extra added. I think, just remembering you're in someone's personal space and build that personal connection to deserve being there.
Joshi, you were nodding along quite vigorously there. Does that all sort of strike with you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that when I started the company, Mill Media, 5 years ago, something was changing in the way that people were thinking about media business models, in a sense. If you guys remember that the previous orthodoxy, let's say 10 years ago, was that you could only charge subscriptions in media if you had what we used to call critical mass. The idea was that you had to produce a certain amount of content every day. It was normally defined as, 20 stories on your website a day or 50 stories on your website a day. Obviously, some of the big people who are having success with online subscriptions at that point were publishing 100, 150. And so what the Substack boom and the paid newsletter boom has changed is it's made all of us realize that people will pay for incredibly low volumes of content as long as those newsletters that they get are heavily differentiated, as you said. And in many cases, as long as they have a kind of individual voice to them, they have a kind of emotional connection to the audience. Now, if you think about that shift, that's a sort of enormous shift in thinking, because to produce 20 stories a day, you're going to have to invest millions of pounds a year minimum, normally. And to produce, what I was producing at the beginning, which was one newsletter per week on my own, then 2 newsletters per week, then now we send 4 in each city. You can do that with a much smaller team. And therefore, if people are willing to give, to pay £10 a month for 4 newsletters a week, you can put a lot of work and a lot of heart and a lot of quality into those newsletters in a way that you couldn't if you had the same size team and you were trying to do 20 stories a day. So there's been a massive shift in the kind of underlying thinking, the logic of online business models. And that is why people now can start an email newsletter on their own and charge the same amount of money or more, double in some cases, than the New York Times does over the course of a month. That opens up a ton of interesting opportunities in terms of innovation, because people can do things at a very low cost, low quality, and actually build up quite a lot of recurring revenue. That's the really exciting change that I think that we're seeing. And in answer to your original question, I think that's going to grow a lot.
That's fantastic. Well, we are, I think, almost out of time. I just wanted to go back down the line one last time with quite a trite and obvious question. So I wondered if you were going to give any advice to somebody who was looking to get into that, either step into your shoes as one of your newsletter-specific roles or launch their own newsletter. What would be the one bit of advice that you would give them? Would it be consistency? Would it be, communicate the mission well enough? What would that piece of advice be?
I think my piece of advice would be to create something in a market or a space where there is clearly an undersupply. There are a lot of good media innovations in the past decade in the UK, which are sort of creditable companies, but they have created companies in spaces that are extremely busy and competitive. And there are, in fact, a lot of segments, verticals, and local areas where there is a vast undersupply of journalism or of content, where the demand is much higher than the supply. And I would advise people to go there because there's a huge social value in creating products in those places. But it's also a lot easier to get a business going more efficiently if you don't have 20 global competitors.
Yep, checks out. Rosie?
I would recommend thinking of your audience as you would yourself. So how would you personally interact with an email? What would you like to see when you're opening your inbox, especially in a really saturated market at the moment? So what are you offering that's different? What are you offering that's personal to this person and can actually build a relationship with them? And also, what are you offering that is more mindful about content consumption? Because when we're looking at local news or specific newsletters, people are consuming content in a completely different way. I think we've been, for so long, bombarded by every big news outlet on most social platforms, for example, are doing the same stories, are covering the same things, maybe slightly different angles. Newsletters, I think, is a way to really make that a lot more personal and curate the content that you're delivering in a really overcrowded market. And I think that's going to be really valuable when people are feeling a lot of publisher news fatigue as well.
Makes a lot of sense. And Henry, a lot of what you do is not replicable by people outside Bloomberg, but what would be a piece of advice that you would give?
I would say think about why the newsletter needs to exist. Do something that you're passionate about, because the internet, broadly speaking, has shown that you'll find an audience that way. And third, think about the reader utility here. What are you really bringing to people's lives, and what is the service that you're providing, whether that's curation and saving them time, or whether that's just building a relationship with you and other people in that community. When I've gone to some Substack events, I'm shocked by how many people show up, and I'm shocked by how enthusiastic people are. And people are just really hungry for in-person meetings and to meet each other and to find like-minded folks.
So a very belated thank you to the panel for joining us and sharing their experiences. If you want the key learnings from this in writing, just head to voices.media or make sure you're signed up to our newsletter to get it straight to your inbox every Tuesday. Now, if you enjoyed that panel, the chances are you'll love being in person at the summit and connecting with like-minded people on July the 8th, or nerding out on newsletters, podcasts and other products, as one of last year's attendees said. Head to voices.media/events for links to the summit and more on the awards. I personally would love to welcome you there. Now, we're taking a short break for Easter, but we'll be back on the 13th of April with a fascinating interview with Faversham House CEO Amanda Barnes. She'll be sharing what it takes to transform a traditional B2B company to be fit for the future, building valuable memberships, and going all in on sustainability. Until then, keep up with all things Media Voices by following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to the publisher newsletter on voices.media. Goodbye and have a great Easter.